okay, I keep saying I'm going to do this, and then I go a couple months. I know. But just updates. It is December 25th of 2024 that I'm recording this. So that's Christmas. I am almost done with my book, and I say that loosely, but way more accurately than I have in the past. I'm approaching the end of chapter 25. I actually think I'm going to be adding another 4 or 5,000 words by the end of it. Wait, what chapter did I say? Chapter 10. I'm approaching the end of chapter 10. Just for update, I don't remember where I was last time. I bet I might have finished chapter 9 and chapter 12, maybe. I don't even think I'd finished chapter 12 by that point. I finished chapter 12, which is the really important thing. And I've been piecing together very important parts of my religious understanding of God. And it's beautiful. I think that my understanding of God has shown me a beauty in the world, and that it's helped quell my soul. Now, don't get me wrong, I've had a few lonely spells between last time and now. Probably like 2. But that's been how many months? I don't know. But some of that is just because, sometimes you get lonely. Anyways, I uncovered. This is a very recent uncovering. I uncovered something that sat in the back of my mind, probably for like the last 6-7 years. Let's see. I graduated in December of 18. So actually, literally the last 6 years. It's taken me 6 years to get here. And what I mean by graduate is graduate from college. And that's nutty. 6 years is a long time. Anyways, I believe that while I think that reality has some underpinning features that help build parts of the world. How I put this. You know how how there's like a game like structure and how things are made. They have to meet certain parameters to stay functional within the world. So like an engineer has to meet certain parameters for each individual part whenever he's making something. So like for example, bridges, you have to be able to support the cars to cross water, cross over a river usually, or a canyon. You have to have material that can support that, but you also have to have material that's strong enough to support itself. And you have to be able to create a structure as cheaply as possible, because otherwise you would just fill the entire canyon from the ground up, right? That's pretty ineffective. There's restraints. Whenever you make something, there's a game-like structure involved. And that's just an idea I'm starting with. I think one of the game-like structures of reality is fractalism. Basically, each section of reality has things within the hierarchy that are extremely consistent. Like, all things that fly have wings, or something close to that. Yeah, actually, that probably works. All things that fly have wings. Now, not all things that have wings fly, but all things that fly have wings of some sort. A propulsion system to overpower the forces of gravity such that they can soar through the air. And in fact, you can make a similar statement. There's an overlap between things that fly and things that swim. You have to be able to propel yourself through the water, but also make sure you don't sink. and it's very similar, but there's different parameters. And I think flight is probably the higher order thing that you can do, because it's really easy to sink in air, but it's not very easy to sink in water. But in water, you have this other difficulty of you have to be able to absorb oxygen, or carbon dioxide for that matter, but you have to be able to absorb something from within the water. So there's different issues, because that's actually a really hard thing to do, because water has a tendency to drag things out of cells via, I think it's osmosis. I think that's the word you use for it. All of reality, this is another thing that kind of plays into all of reality, is built off gradients. And what I mean by that is energy gradients are what form electricity. What is the issue with osmosis there? The list goes on and on and on. The reason why your muscles can move is because our muscles actually create electronic impulses by storing positive ions and creating a positive ion gradient, such that there is a current that is like there is a positive and negative pole, and it's not the exact same as electricity that runs through your walls, except it is, because it's molecules. It's an electronic impulse, but you're just dealing in positives the entire time, because it's all gradients. If you ever want to understand what I'm talking about there, look up how nerves function. It's not just nerves though, because that entire system works throughout all of your cells. That's how your cells bring in sugars. That's how your cells destroy themselves. There's a whole litany of cellular processes that revolve, like all of the cellular processes revolve around gradients of energy and gradients of molecule distribution. Things want to stabilize always. They want to equalize. And most of life's purpose is to disrupt the equilibrium and exploit the energy gained, harvested from allowing specific molecules and specific energy to be released from releasing that gradient to equalize. I'm saying all this to set up a really unique idea. I think that one of the bases for reality is dialogue. One of the inherent processes of reality is dialogue. And what I mean by that is, fractally, if you see cell as the basic unit of life, now not all cells, but actually no, they all use a storage technique for, and this is where I actually think that this is how you identify life, if it uses a storage technique with fidelity enough to replicate and to translate for proteins. And I'm saying like self-replicate. I'm not saying hijacking other cells' machinery. So this is where I say viruses aren't actively alive, because they don't replicate on their own. They have to hijack other organisms to replicate. And does that mean that parasites aren't alive? I think if you gave them a form of energy, they could self-replicate. or they could find another. Most parasites actually are they're autogenic, and that's the wrong word, but they self-replicate. And what I mean by all this is that DNA/RNA uses dialogue as a way to safety check itself, and as a way to transcribe for proteins, and as a way to most organisms, I'll put it like this. Most organisms have duplicate versions of genes, specifically so that way they can have those genes regulated at different levels, so that they can let the radiation of existence have differing effects at mutating those genes, such that there's room for intentional error in cells, such that you can allow genes to mutate, and hopefully they don't break apart. They don't kill the organism. All organisms actually do this. Now, of course, some organisms just don't protect very well at all, and you'll get bacteria that will have mutations. Like, if you were to take an eyedropper and suck up a pretty cloudy medium with bacterial growth, you'd probably get a mutation in there, because there's probably something like 50,000 bacteria per cubic centimeter of water. And when you're sucking up 3 cubic centimeters of water, or even if it's half a cubic centimeter of water, the rate of mutation can be as low as as high as 1 in 10,000, and you will almost guarantee get a bacteria that has a mutation, right? But at different levels of complexity, each organism has to start having more regulation on their genome, but they also have the opportunity to have multiple copies. Because they're more complex, they're allowed to obtain the extra energy to support multiple copies of the genes. Because it's actually an energy-intensive thing to replicate cells. And part of that, which is extremely expensive, is the ability to replicate your genome, the entire collection of your genetic makeup. And now, I'm not saying that each individual, I'm not saying like the entire within an organism, I'm saying the entirety within the cell. Because actually organisms tend to have mutations all the time. The only important ones are the ones that are in the reproductive organs. But that's all beside the point. So anyways, there's this idea that your cells are allowed to have some mutations to experiment with the fringes, or with things that have been deemed acceptable, like things that have been deemed that are important enough to have duplicates of. So what I mean by this is, like, in mammals, the vast majority of mammals actually have 3+ copies of lactose, what is it called? The enzyme that allows mammals to digest lactose, to break it down such that it can be digested by babies. And just for reference, that enzyme is normally downregulated to complete silencing by the time children by the time they leave infancy. And it's a very rare thing that white humans, I say white humans, European descending humans, so white, but you get the idea. It's not white, it's European descending humans, still drink milk and eat milk products, because like that gets into a completely separate idea, and that's an epigenetic regulation, where we started eating milk products because it was something that we just had to start doing because it was hard to find food. But we found this food, and we would rather shit ourselves than go starving. That's literally what was going on, in case you don't understand. So, this is going to end up being long, but that's okay. So, and this is all actually going to build up. This is like one of those Jordan Peterson lectures. So, Europeans started eating milk, and that allowed the regulatory system of our genes to remove the downregulation of those genes. Because if you just continue to feed your children milk until they're of reproductive age, those genes are still upregulated. And actually, we found out shortly after the Holocaust, when we started doing case studies, that humans actually propagate epigenetic changes along with normal genetic material. Now, why am I going all off on that tangent? DNA is wound up in a double helix. So this is where that dialogue comes in. It's in an anti-parallel double helix. So what this means is there are two strands of DNA that are actively reading in different directions. So they have different purposes, sort of, but they are able to match together, and they're actually allowed to have, and in different parts of the genome, there's room for specific genes to have variation applied to them by radiation. And what I'm trying to get at is your genome is set up in a dialogical fashion, and it's to me that's really cool. And it's not just that your DNA runs anti-parallel. You have two copies of the same chromosomes. Let that sink in. So you could actually have two different copies of a gene that get expressed differentially. And that's where this idea of a of a gradient comes in. Because we actually know through Gregor Mendel's work that DNA, like genes actually get expressed on a gradient, on a spectrum of expression. And even though there are some peas that are short, and some plants that are short, and some pea plants that are tall, yada yada yada, there's actually a gradient of that expression. And sometimes it's just binary, because you have to meet a certain threshold. But sometimes sometimes there's a lot of variation. And some of that could be, like in humans, obviously height, there's a major variation on that. But there's also major variation on IQ, there's major variation on skin tone. The vast majority of your genes actually operate on a gradient, which is cool. And it's not just they operate on a gradient. That gradient is derived from a dialogical process between the genes within your genome, which is derived from a dialogical process between the DNA base pairs within the DNA chain. And if that's not cool enough, I'm going to spring something on you. You know how DNA, just for your information, DNA can be spliced differently to have one gene code for multiple purposes, for multiple proteins, however that may be. Or even just sometimes a gene can code for a specific RNA sequence, which actually just goes out into the cell. For example, ribosomes have a specific, or actually a mixture of DNA, well, of RNA and protein, and you have to have that because otherwise you can't transcribe from mRNA to protein legitimately. Like, you can't go from one to the next. You actually need the base pairing to match up, so that way you can know what three letter codon is there for the energy molecule to come in. And what I mean by energy molecule is ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is interchangeable with, like, it's almost energetically negligible the amount of energy it takes to swap between ATP, GTP, CTP, and TTP. And so I'm just going to call them energy molecules, which is a nice understanding because that also translates into information. I'm gonna skip back around to the original idea. Your brain actually is it's modeled after DNA. And what I mean by that is ideas can overlap. It's not just that. Your brain is built from the bottom up the same way DNA is. So most of your DNA at any one time is wound up. And that's to create differential expression. It means you actually don't want your DNA unwound most of the time, because you actually want most of your genes protected at any one time, and you only want to unwind specific genes for specific proteins at any specific time based on circumstances. And actually, this is going to sound crazy, but there's a specific reason why I'm saying this. Only about 10% of your DNA is unwound at any one time. Now, why is that crazy? Because only 10% of your brain is used at any one time. And why is that crazy? Because actually your brain only accesses specific portions of your memory at any one time. And actually there's a lot of your brain that's just wired. And I mean that pretty literally. There's a lot of stuff that just wires together, and you just let it sit, and it's just an undertone underneath all of the processes within your brain. So, like, your ability to walk, it's actually a very controlled fall. And your ability to run, oh boy. But you don't think about it like that. In fact, some people might think it's left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot. But no, actually there's a lot of muscular memory that's going on there. And that stuff's not even on your brain. That's mapped straight onto your spinal cord, which is another really cool thing. Your brain runs highly organized processes, highly organized programs, without you even realize you're doing it. And in fact, actually they've learned that in most studies, your brain, it's your brain will do your body will do the walking without your brain even telling you to do it. Well, telling your body to do it. They found that in studies of people who are disabled, people who are paraplegic, if you put them on a treadmill, their legs will walk on their own, meaning that is a built-in feature. That's like an underpinning part of your brain. That's just like you're genetically coded to respond to spiders and snakes before your brain recognizes you actually see them. Like, that's the same idea. And that goes, how do I put this? Like, those are some examples of your brain's programmed to do some things before it actually recognizes them. But there's this idea that your brain actually has most things wound up at all times, and it only has to access them when there's an emergency. And this is really cool. And also, like, when you go through major trauma and you go through PTSD, when your entire world shifts, that's when you can imagine that, like, that's when your that is when your DNA is completely unwound and it winds back up wrong. And actually, one of the best solutions to PTSD is either a complete religious overhaul, a religious experience, or a medical intervention that has similar effects. And that's also the same treatment that they use for alcoholics and for any addicts. And why that may sound crazy is, how do I put this? It's like introducing a protein into it's like your cell producing a protein that is specifically there to help solve a folding problem in proteins that are coming out that normally would function a specific way and would fold a specific way, but for whatever reason there was a folding issue at your DNA level, and it had to unfold and refold to create the specific protein to fix the issue. It's like a production line issue. I know that's not worded correctly, but it's getting at the same idea. And why am I going on these tangents? Well, you may ask yourself, well, if the brain is mapped onto DNA in the same way, what maps onto the brain? And that's where I say ideas do, sort of. How do I put this? I think that religions map directly onto human beings. And what I mean by that is, like, in some sense, each individual is allowed to have there's actually room for error and room for there's room for autonomy within the individual. Cells actually have autonomy as long as they are doing the job that they have been programmed to do. So, like, obviously your skin cells, their job is to die. I know it sounds horrible. So they're actually allowed to have a lot of autonomy. And if you were to actually scrape off skin cells, you'd find that a lot of skin cells probably have, the vast majority of mutations on your body are on your skin cells. Because their job is to die and to protect the rest of your body from solar radiation. And not just solar radiation, but all the radiation from around you. But solar is the most important one because we are exposed to the sun about 60 to 75% of the day, right? So actually, that's not the best solution. But imagine your brain cells. Each brain cell has a little bit of room for error, and not just room for error, but room for autonomy. And in fact, they're not all firing or doing the same thing at the same time. Or you can think of it like a liver cell. They're not all doing the same thing at the exact same time. They each get different inputs. Like, you have too much sugar in your bloodstream, so there's a cascade down. But each one of them are producing proteins at different levels. They're dividing at different times. Your cells are actually partially autonomous. And in fact, they can choose, after they've divided, just to completely shut off their self-replication machinery, and go and put that into dormancy, and they are terminal. And a lot of cells actually do this as a way to prevent cancer. And why am I going down this rabbit hole? Because humans are autonomous, but a lot of us know where we fit into society. And you might think of, like, a mid-level manager as like a spinal nerve trying to tell these specific muscle cells to behave in this way and to clean up their act here and here. And you may see how do I put this? You may see like a plumber as literally like a as like a epithelial cell within your veins, right? Or you may see an electrician as like, how to put this? You'd see them as a different kind of endothelial cell that directly that produces that produces receptors for neurotransmitters, right? And I know this sounds sort of vague. If you know the language, it helps. But there's this idea that if you are within a religion, you aren't just part of the religion. The religion is part of you, and like it's both ways. And in fact, religions are mapped onto people. I know that sounds crazy, but how do you come up with meta ideas? Like, how do you come up with I'm a Christian, so I believe that God is a meta-conscious that has full control of reality. He lets a lot just happen on autonomy, but he will, on occasion, choose to intervene when things are necessary. Like, for example, a guy that sees that he weighs 300 pounds and decides, I need to lose some weight, so he intentionally chooses to not eat one meal a day and drops 30 pounds in 6 months. Something like that. When there's this idea that religions map directly onto people. And actually this is where you come up with the idea that, well, why is monotheism so potent then? Because there's this idea that your conscience is a spirit that sort of rises up from within, that it doesn't dominate, it orchestrates the rest of the minor spirits within you. Your hunger, your rage, your lust, your desire for emotional connection. It helps orchestrate those such that you're not overwhelmed. But also it does other things. Like your consciousness has to be directly tied in with, I shouldn't say it has to be. It is part of the formation of who you are it is formed partially by your worldview. And what I mean by that is your consciousness. This is why I think that God is a meta-consciousness that rules from like 2 stages above everything that is material. God, how to put this? I partially lost where I was. Okay, so if people have ideas and ideas have people, I'm going through this out loud with you guys. Oh yeah, I'm gonna shift a little bit from where I was. It's adjacent, and I'll work my way back to where I was. In fact, they will probably converge from where I was. When you have ideas, so like, let's say women deserve the right to be able to work within the workforce. Is that an innately Christian idea? I'm going to beg to differ. However, I think I agree with it, but I disagree with the intentional... I'm going to come off as sexist, and I'm okay with that. I disagree with the intentional societal the intentional societal direction of women towards the workforce. I think that women have the right to work, not that they all should work. It's not good that every woman needs to have a job. I don't think every man should have a job in the private or public sector, but the vast majority of them should, and less than vast majority of women should work in work in the private and or public sector. And I'm not going into that right now, but there's this idea of a dialogue that happens with the idea. So you're allowed to actually disagree with people. You know that, right? Like when someone puts forth an idea, I think that women deserve the right to work in men's spaces. There's actually this argument, which is a valid argument, that, well, okay, some women won't disrupt the hierarchical system too much. In fact, it may bring with the new blood, and with the fact that women's brains just don't work in the exact same way that men's do, it may bring some different ideas in. But then, what happens when they increase, let's say, 10% of the workforce how about this? 10% of an engineering firm is women. They keep hired roughly on average 60 employees, and 6 of them are women. What happens if it increases to 12? Well, at some point, don't take this the wrong way, but women are more inclined, in general, women are more inclined to interact with other women within a social hierarchy instead of a competence hierarchy. Now, of course, in engineering, it's a very different field, but women still tend to do this a little bit. In fact, they tend to do it a whole lot more than men tend to do it. Men tend to work within competence or power hierarchies, depending upon the field. And sometimes it gets intermixed where I'm at, which I hate, because I hate being a tyrant. Or not even a tyrant, I hate exerting power. I'd like to ask with authority to do the things that I need to get done, because there's more going on than just you're here to scan items for customers. There's a whole lot more than just boop, 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 boop. Trust me. But there's this idea that women tend to rely more on, they tend to create more of a social structure with hierarchies. And actually, as the percentage of women within the workforce increases, so does the amount of the hierarchy that leans towards social influence, and social status. And actually, the place where I work at is overwhelming. The front end is overwhelmingly inhabited by women. I do not mean that in any derogatory way. There are a lot of women that I really enjoy working with. And in fact, a lot of them aren't out after power, they're not out after my job. They are there to do the job well and get paid and go home. And that's wonderful. However, I will say this. Both my bosses are women. One of the other supervisors is a woman. I say that loosely. She's like 19. And she doesn't know anything about the world except that, well, I have these friends that are above me. I'm not going down that rabbit hole, because that's what happened with the previous one. And that one finally, I'm happy now that she's no longer part of the front end. Anyways, the front end does have power dynamics and social status dynamics afoot, when it should just be straight up authority hierarchy with a little bit of power mixed in, because actually this is the really nice thing. When men have authority hierarchies, there is inferred power within them that is, it's sort of social, but it's not entirely social. And it's this idea that the more people that support you as a leader, the harder it is to resist when that leader has to use compulsion because you aren't doing your job. And I have to do this with some of my employees. I have to use compulsion. I have to say, go do this. Well, why? Go do this. I'll explain when you're there. And sometimes that is literally, hey, you're here the latest. These guys leave by 8:30. You're here till 10. and I need a register open, and I need to make sure these guys get all their breaks in. So I have to keep you inside instead of sending you out on carts. And then they're like, yeah, fine, whatever. And sometimes I'm just like, hey, I need you to clean. And it takes them months to realize, yeah, actually, part of what I do is to keep traffic flowing, to make sure none of the ports, none of the outports on the dam, on this power dam, on this literal, instead of producing power, it produces money for the business. That's why I call my registers. They are dam ports, where customers flow through and we extract value from them, and that helps pay for us, right? It takes forever for my employees to realize the reason why all the registers are dirty is because part of my job is to make sure that they're all open as much of the time as possible. So I will have people just swap in and swap in and swap in, and when people leave, oftentimes I'll have someone swap right into the position, and they don't get cleaned till we are slowed down. And what that means is they are dirty by the night, and we have trash sometimes overflowing in our bins at the registers. And most of my guys don't realize, hey, this is one of those things that has to get done. But also, I have not a million other things. I have like 6 other things that have to get done. And most of those things are just condensing down what's out on the sales floor. So that way, by the end of the night, all of the money has been pulled that we've earned for the day. All of the registers are cleaned. All the trash is gone. So that way, everything's ready for the next day. And some of my guys will just drag their feet. And they don't understand, hey, the reason why you have this job is because I'm making sure that all this flows smoothly. So that way we can earn this money for the business, so that way they can pay us. And I have people that'll take 15, 20-minute breaks. And why am I going off on this tangent? This actually is directly tied into the idea. How do I put this? Actually, this is just a tangent, but it is part of my mind, so I will give it credit. There's a reason for hierarchies. Oh yeah, I remember now. The tangent is useful because at some point there is what happens in monotheism is usually it starts as there's a competence hierarchy starting to form between the deities, and eventually one pops out on top. Some examples, obviously Jehovah. We're not going to say Yahweh. It's Jehovah. That's the real name of God. It got leaked very early on in Christianity by a Jewish convert. Because let's just be clear, Christianity is a Jewish death cult. And I'm all for it, obviously. But it's this idea that you die while you're alive, so that way you live after you die. And not just that, so that way you continue to live while you're alive. You die a little bit every day. So that way you make one big death and rebirth while you're alive, then you continue to die a little bit and rebirth yourself a little bit every day while you're alive, such that you live longer and such that people see the progress in your life and follow after your example, and such that when your life is over, you come to God and God says, well, you were a failure, but you took the plunge metaphorically, and actually metaphorically, but also metaphysically, and you continued to follow by faith my word. You continue to do my will. Welcome home, my good and faithful servant. Your sins are pardoned with the blood that you baptized yourself into. That's actually what my religion says. God walked on the earth and lived a perfect life. There's actually two big sacrifices going on with God, at least two that I could pull out. There's one, the perfect living sacrifice of walking perfectly within the law, the old Jewish law, but then not just walking perfectly, going above and beyond and calling for a higher way of living. It's not just thou shalt not bear false witness. That's not lying. That is when you go before a court or before other people within a court-like setting, you swear on God that I am saying the truth, and then you lie. And that is a completely different system than thou shalt not lie, period. Instead of thou shalt not kill, it's not thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not murder. Christians say thou shalt not, it's not even thou shalt not kill, it's thou shalt not contain hatred, because hatred is so consuming that it will lead you to killing. Something like that. And it goes on and on and on. Thou shalt not lust. And the Jews would say, you can't, it's not thou shalt not commit adultery, it's thou shalt not lust. And in fact, the Jews would say, well, that's still after someone else's wife. But most Protestant Christians nowadays will say, you shouldn't constantly be thinking about having sex with someone who's not your wife. It's not even constantly. And where is the boundary between where is it lust and where is it just a fleeting thought? And that's the room for error, but somewhere around 1 or 2 times, if you start playing with that line, you're doing something wrong when you start playing with that line. You let it be a fleeting thought, and if it continues to be a fleeting thought, it's no longer a fleeting thought. It is a persistent, pervasive thought that you need to handle. And that's if you start wondering where that line is, you've crossed it. That's the Christian idea. We are called to something higher than Judaism. We're called to hold the law as a father. Literally, God the Father, embodied as the law, as Jesus, brought it to us and said, you failed, but you are being called to something higher. The law was there as a teacher, and now we are going to hold you to a higher standard. The law was 6th grade, now we're talking college level stuff. There's a reason behind the law, so we're going to call it to its higher calling, and you're going to hold that as your highest standard for now. Or just in general, you're supposed to hold that to its highest standard. And you will miss that, and that's okay, because you already missed the law, right? So, that's important, but you will miss that, but because you're aiming at a higher place, the law falls short of your glory because you are embodying me. How do I put that? That's not perfect, but we are... How do I put this? We are beautiful instruments in the sight of the Lord. That's how I want to put it. We are beautiful instruments, and while we sing songs, the most powerful thing we do is we tell stories. Because you don't win over atheists. You don't win over people who are... you don't win over converts with pure reason. You actually win more people with the power of story. And that's not... And that is extremely... that is so pervasive throughout the entire Bible, Old and New Testament, that there's this idea that that's the reason why we see through story. We do everything through story. That's one of the other underlying parts of reality. Humans interpret reality through story because God created reality for storytelling. Because the metaconsciousness saw that it was perfect, but it created imperfect beings to tell its story so compelling that it would be called to a higher calling. So it's not just treat your slaves better. It is, you shouldn't have slaves because we are all equal before God. And it's not just, and part of that is we are all guilty before Him. Right? And this isn't big man in the sky. This is the meta consciousness, Father. And actually, you could say, if the meta consciousness is the Father, it's the law, but it's also, when the law is given to us, it is the truth. So Jesus has to embody the law in order to give it to us. So the law is the truth. The law is a meta law because it sets up a game for us to play within. Back to that engineering idea. You don't want your bridge to fall apart because someone, because part of the crew, and what I mean by part of the crew is oftentimes there are specific subcontractors to specific things. So like if there's lighting on the bridge, you actually don't necessarily want your engineer, like you have the engineer set up all the blueprints, but you don't want you want specific construction guys called electricians to set up the lighting on the bridge. So if let's say you outsource it to a third party electrician company to come out and do it within a couple days instead of hiring your own guys, and it takes them a couple weeks, they come just through and do it in a couple days because this is what they do for a living, and they're very good at it, and they're specialized at it. What happens if they're corrupt? They don't play by the same rules you do, and actually this is an issue in society. If people don't play by the same rules you do, your society actually doesn't function very well, which is actually part of the issue why America has fallen so far. There's this idea that if different parts of society have different values than you do, they value different things, so they hold different things at different values. They could just pocket some of the money and do a shitty job. They could pocket the entire sum, assuming that they're doing a good job, and they just do a shitty job, and not just cutting man hours, but by cutting the amount they spend on resources like wiring and good lights and good fixtures. And I know this sounds like it's way out there, but it's not. It comes back into this idea. There's actually a reason why you have to have dialogue. If an idea prevents its holders from having good faith dialogue with a different idea, why? You have to ask a good reason why. If that is because it knows it's not going to have a good faith dialogue with the other idea because the other idea doesn't value the truth or value its meta-truths, it doesn't value that they have to hold true to their believers, then like that is an okay argument to say, we know that you're not going to have a good faith argument with us, so we're not actually going to have a dialogue with you until you fix that. It's like knowing that knowing that section, like this portion of DNA that looks like it's circular instead of extremely long, so long that you can't see the ends of it, to know the difference allows you to see it, whether it's good faith or bad faith. And cells can do that. If you didn't know, cells can see that's a plasmid instead of a section of DNA that is designed to fit specifically back into this, this foot fits into this shoe. Like, cells can do that, by the way. This is where it's all hierarchical, right? It's not just hierarchical. It is, what was the word? Fractal, also. You can see that stuff. You can tell when someone comes in bad faith. You can look at their track record. You can talk to the people, what they value. You can tell if they're there to do a professional job, or if they're there to earn a paycheck, or if they're even there just to go in and do it as fast as they can with as low cost as they can. And it's not necessarily efficient because they know it's going to break down before the warranty's over, and they're just not going to respond when you make a warranty claim until it's too late. Like, they're going to make bad faith decisions intentionally out to exploit you. You can tell when this stuff's going to happen. Sometimes it takes a little bit of training, but again, cells have to train. And in fact, our immune cells have specific colonies of cells that they have to train on your body cells. And if those cells attack native you cells, they are killed off. This is how our immune system works, right? And it's not just this is how our immune system works. This is how our cells work. If your cell starts producing, if your cell doesn't recognize bad material, or if it recognizes good material as bad, the cell will go through apoptosis, which is automated cell death. You will die if you can't figure out, and like, it's not just you will die, your metaphysics will die, and your psychology will just absolutely collapse if you can't figure out how people are out to exploit you, right? In fact, this isn't even all that hard to understand. You're actually, while you're growing up between the ages of 4 and 10, I'm going to say roughly that. Yeah, actually, yes, that. Because by the age of 4, you're supposed to be socialized. From the ages of 4 to roughly 10 to 13, you're actually training to be able to decipher out through play with other human beings, dialogical play, who is in good faith, who's playing with you, and who's not actually playing with you, who's playing you, who's in bad faith, interacting with you, not actually playing the right game. They're playing a game on you, not with you. You can actually figure this stuff out. So actually, human beings actually map into ideas, and then those ideas are how I was talking about before, those ideas have to have a dialogue. And in fact, out of that dialogue, there forms a hierarchy. And the hierarchy that is formed is created by a meta-consciousness, which is God, right? So there's actually this idea that humanity, like when you ask, what if humanity didn't exist, would there be God? And then you'd actually have to ask, you actually have to ask the reverse question at the same time. If there's no God, is there humanity? And then what the heck do you do with that question? And the answer is, because those two are in a mirror, the tension there creates a dialogue. And you actually come to the conclusion that, not because I think I am, you come to a different conclusion. Because I am, he is the great I am. Something like that. Because you can think of an I am statement, because you have a consciousness. There's this meta consciousness that you can draw from other people. You can figure out who's conscious, right? You can figure out what consciousness entails, what the greatest form of that consciousness is. And like somewhere two ideas above you, there is this meta consciousness, which is even greater than what you can imagine, and that's God. And you can actually have a dialogue with God, and that should be mind-blowing. Because once you start having a dialogue with God, that's when you become an Israelite. Israel means we who wrestle with God. And that's where that's where this idea of reality, part of reality's underpinning, is the ability to have a dialogue with the metaconsciousness of God. And it's all the way up and down throughout our entire, it's all the way through, up and down through the entirety of creation, down to the molecular level, down to the atomic level. There's an intentional tension between a atom's core and the 3 football fields distance of the electron field outside of it. In the electron field, there's a play there such that they are intentionally spaced out, such that they are either paired within the field, within the electron field with another electron, or they are out waiting for a pair from a different atom to create a molecule. And the fact that God created a, how do I put this, a permanently excited molecule, a permanently excited carbon, just permanently excited carbon such that it can bond in the way it does, is amazing. Because most of the time you'd only have the ability for 2 electrons to bond, but instead you have 4, which means there's, for whatever reason, like that molecule, like that atom acts way out of normal possibility, but at the same time, because it can do that, it forms mega molecules, and you are made 99% out of that, not 99, about 98% of that mega molecule, right? Like, you're made out of mostly carbon. And each of those carbons are in dialogue with the atoms around them. And even though the carbon atom can't see the molecule, like it can interact enough with the molecules around it, it can't see the cell that it is part of. And there's no way on earth it can see the human that it's part of. It doesn't even compute how big the human is that it is a part of. And God is like infinitely bigger than all of that. And between the tension and the dialogue, like, that is, I know I'm sounding mystical, but that's the point. I'm okay with sounding mystical when reality is screaming at me. All of reality is a dialogue and a tension between ideas and between atoms and between people and between people and God. I know this is long, and I know I went on tangents, but they were actually important tangents to show continuity between the levels of reality, up and down, are so up and down throughout the entire hierarchy. There's continuity at each level, and that's really important because it shows that there's also fractal continuity across the entire system. That's my cool idea for today. If you like the video, please comment and share it with other people. I know this is a John Verveakien idea that I just went crazy with. I don't even know if it's a Petersonian idea. I think it's a Verveakien idea. That dialogue is an underpinning rule of reality. You have to have a dialogue with someone else and or with God in order to be able to exist. So it's not even if a tree falls in a forest, because the tree is still in dialogue with the other trees, because there has to be a suitable distance for it to have grown up from where it was. It's not even that. It's, if I'm not talking with anyone, do I exist? Like, that's an even cooler question. If I don't talk to anyone else in my entire life, do I even exist? How does that even work? How do you not talk to someone else for your entire life?